Order, order. Welcome to this session of the Justice Committee. Welcome to the Permanent Secretary and senior officials. Grateful to see you all. We'll come to you very shortly, but we'd have to do the usual declarations of interest. I'm a non-practising barrister, former consultant to a law firm.
I'm a barrister with a current practising certificate, but not taking on any direct court work. I'm former Solicitor General, former Chair of CAFCAS, former Chair of the National Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel. My brother is Chair of the Prison Reform Trust, and I've recently taken on a role giving informal advice to ministers on family justice.
Mr. Daly, beat that.
No, I can't beat that. I'm a practising solicitor and partner in a firm of solicitors.
I think there's anything. I don't think anybody else will have any. Well, welcome. Permanent Secretary, would you like just to introduce yourself and I'll ask your officials to introduce themselves as well. We know them, but for the record.
Great, thank you, Chair. I'm Antonia Romeo, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Justice and Principal Accounting Officer.
My name's Goodwin. I am the Chief Executive of His Majesty's Courts and Tribunals Service.
My name is Rees. I'm the CEO of HMPPS.
I'm James McEwen. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Ministry.
Thank you all very much for coming to help us. Can we start with the money, if I might, Ms Romeo? Looking at the supplementary estimates, which we've just had provided, looking at those for 23-24, and then tracking back, what we see is, isn't it, that the department sought to increase the resource, DEL, for want of a better word, departmental expenditure limit, I think, increase the resource element by 521 million. Now, that's, as I read it, includes 190 million being switched from capital to resource. So what were the resource pressures? What were the spending pressures, the day-to-day spending pressures that caused you to have to do that?
Great, well, thank you. The first thing, as you've already noted, Chair, the reserve claim itself was only 253 million because of the 521 you mentioned. 190 was the net switch, so it's a net switch from capital to resource. Obviously, it was disappointing to have a reserve claim this year because we obviously seek to avoid having one, and we hadn't had one for a few years. In fact, not since the pandemic. We had already absorbed a large number of pressures in a year. Including inflation, 766 million for inflation we absorbed, and other pay pressures during the efficiency and spending review. We also had absorbed an additional 150 million of costs on 155 million prison officer pay, 50 million for Operation Safeguard, and 70 million of judicial pay. So we had absorbed a significant amount from the increases. We had some additional unforeseen expenditure. As you'll know, reserve claims have to be unforeseen and unabsorbable, and those included the cost of living payments, that went to staff, which was 89 million. We had an income shortfall in fees and fines of 92 million. We had judicial pay and pension costs, particularly in the Special Educational Needs and Disability Tribunal, following the Southby case. We had the Harbour Trust impacts from the Supreme Court judgment, and then we had some pre-agreed elements, including the turnaround grant, which was 11 million, and some shared outcomes fund spending that we had also pre-agreed.
Any financial implications of the McLeod judgment, as it's sometimes been referred to, had that already worked its way through the system then?
Yes, none within this year that we couldn't absorb. I think that's right. James might want to add.
There are some judicial pay, some judicial pension costs associated with Southby, so that there is a combination
with McLeod.
Yes, but there are some pensions costs in that line as well.
And what about for future years? Do you anticipate further outflow?
Yeah, we're working all that through now and talking to the Treasury, but to make sure that that's fully funded.
So there are continued, but the likelihood is one way or another there are going to be pressures, so they're going to need to be funded somehow.
Exactly right.
Going forward around that. Okay. You told me about the shortfall in the fee income, etc., which is helpful. Can I just then have a look at the other side of the coin? There's also an increase in the supplementary estimate of the resource AME, the annually managed expenditure. of 215 million. That's 45%. I mean, that's an extraordinary high-level permanent secretary, isn't it? Well, what gave rise to a 45% increase in the RAME?
Well, so a large amount of this, so the 41 million of it is impairments. And these were essentially, it's like an asset, it's a technical adjustment, it's an asset revaluation based on the way that we value prisons and courts, which we can go into in more detail. We had 92 million for litigation. And that's when we, obviously I can't go into detail because it might prejudice our position in that litigation, but we make a provision if it's more likely than not that we're going to need to make a payment in the future. And then 83 million was other provisions, which includes things like legal aid outstanding casework.
Litigation, without going into the detail, can include any types of claims for litigation brought against the ministry or its agent, or its agencies, I think.
Yes, exactly. In the whole group, if we anticipate that
we
might need
could be
money.
Claims against court service, prison service, or whatever. So people understand that's what we're talking about. And the impairments in relation to prison and courts, is that in relation to value of estate property?
Yes. So essentially, the way it works is we evaluate. We have to evaluate in a certain way that can exclude some costs that in reality are what the value, when you're actually building the prison, for example, what the value would be. So, for example, some site costs wouldn't be included. So the difference between those two things we have to account for, and it could go up as well as down. But that amount is an impairment. It's a technical adjustment, and it doesn't relate to mismanagement or loss or anything like that. It's a technical line.
Of course, those things, those technical adjustments, occur every year, one way or another. There'll always be a line around that when you come and give evidence to us. There's always a provision for litigation, because there's always litigation at one volume or another going on. But that still doesn't perhaps therefore explain why there's the exceptional increase up to the 45% increase in resource del, given that you've got those things which are common, maybe a bit more this year than previous years. But what else is it that drives it?
Well, I mean, I'll bring in James in a minute, but I think obviously the lion's share of this 216 was the 92 for litigation provisions. So as it happens, we had a particularly significant year on litigation that we had to provide for.
What was the year before? Can you remember? Can you help me?
Well, I can...
Just so we get a sense of why it was so significantly
James,
different.
you've got the...
Well, I'll look now.
Should we? Perhaps we could keep going, and then
can
James
we come back to that? But I'd just be interested to know, was it particularly unusual in terms of a spike, for want of a better word? But the other thing I noticed looking at the other supplementary estimates, because I mean, essentially the explanation we had from the department was that these relate to provisions and impairments which are centrally held. That's fairly standard. I noticed the Crown Prosecution Service wrote off, in fact, by way of impairment, some 10 million in relation to changes to the scope of the common platform. Now, we know that's been quite well publicised, the changes to scope. How much of this increase in the resource AME is due to any write-offs or impairments in relation to MOJ or HMCTS, more like the elements of the common platform changes and rescoping?
You want to start, Nick, and then...
So in this year, so as you say, other than the part you picked up on in terms of the cost that was written off because we didn't fully integrate with common platform and the CPS, no further costs have been written off this year in relation to reform other than £860,000 in respect of adoption proceedings, which if you'll recall when we were last here, we changed the scope of reform and took adoption out of scope.
Yes.
And we had incurred that money, and therefore that is written off.
Okay.
Perhaps I may add, Chair, you'll remember that a year or two ago we had incurred a fruitless payment because of some work that the CPS had been doing to develop their case management system. That meant that the work that we had been doing had to essentially ended up being fruitless. This is, as it were, the flip side of that, which is now the CPS have had to write something off because of work that has happened on the common platform that has meant that ended up being fruitless.
Well, I noticed that we had some announcement very recently about further changes to scope and rollout of common platform. So some things are not going to happen in the time frame that was perhaps originally envisaged. Is there any fruitless expenditure we anticipate falling into next year going forward as a result of those changes?
As we put the accounts down for next year, we will disclose any write-offs from common platform as a result of the very recent changes that I wrote to the committee about. Yes. They're not disclosed yet in this report we're looking at.
I agree, not in this report, but since you're on top of the management information, I wondered if you could give us a sense as to what pressures that might give you going forward for next year.
I expect that to be around £5.5 million.
About £5.5 million. Thanks very much. That's helpful. And yes.
I think that James is...
Yeah, you found it, James. Thank you very much. Yes.
So at the supplementary last year, we had a budget of 633 million for resource Amy. That compares to 697 million at this for this supplementary estimate. And just the reasons it's Amy is because of the inherent volatility. So by definition, these are volatile areas of spend. Yeah. And we also, so it's quite hard to get a really taut and realistic estimate. So you will see, so outturn last year was actually of that 600, of the 633, our outturn was actually only 102, and that was due to a large number of some of this litigation, and it's very difficult to anticipate what year litigation might fall in. So we tend to make sure that we don't breach control total by accident, and give ourselves some comfort on that total. And as Antonia explained, our Amy budget is all around the value of future liabilities and changes in provisions. There's no sort of economic fiscal expenditure associated with that. So some of the changes to do with impairment, which is on the property side, that will be volatile at the moment because we have lots of assets under construction, and then as we bring them into use, that triggers the revaluation that Antonia was talking about. So a really good example, a new prison. As it's an asset under construction, we capitalise certain spend. As soon as it's in use, we have to revalue it. The book value will change using an accounting methodology known as direct replacement costs, and that means that we have to exclude some of the input costs to build the prison are excluded in that calculation, and that creates a book value change, and that's called an impairment for the purposes of the accounts and the subs.
So, Ms. Rees, from the prison service point of view, the impairment will be around exactly as I said there, the value of the new prisons, I take it, and the total extra costs in terms of pay, prison officers' pay, and other matters, because there was an award that was given. Which we government rightly perhaps
I think the Perm Sec's already said we've had about 150 million extra for pay. So how it happens is we try and make a prediction of how much we think the pay are going to be, but as you know, it's an independent pay review body, so if it comes in slightly above that, we then have separate pressure.
Do you identify any other potential pressures in the prison service in relation to resource or capital, Amy or Dell?
Yeah, so I guess our two largest pressures are always around pay, and any changes in year to pay. We also had the cost of living payment last year, which affected probation staff, and then the other is capacity. Safeguard was mentioned, so we've got another bucket of costs around running ourselves, obviously at a very high level of capacity occupancy at the moment.
And provision, I take it, has not yet been planned, but will we have to be planned for the staffing arrangements for the new prisons when they come through? Have you got projected costs around that yet?
So obviously we know the unit cost of our prisons, but some of our new prisons will be under contract, and so therefore it's slightly different, and they determine their pay rates for their own staff. But all of that we have secured with HMT. Obviously, when we do our business case, we know there will be a resource cost to running those prisons as well.
Are you able to give any ballpark figure of what sort of thing we're potentially looking at?
It will really vary site to site, and it will depend on the contracted site. Depends on whether we're going to run it ourselves or via contract and how much that is. And
when are you likely to know that?
Well, we haven't announced some of those awards of those contracts yet because we're still in a commercial process.
I understand that, but what's the time frame for doing it? If you're starting to build them, you want to have it ready to get them
of course.
Up.
So the next one to open is obviously Mill Psych, and so that we expect that to be announced probably in the next 6 months or so.
Okay. Can I just add I've got Mill Site will open in this SR period, so the money, as Amy has said, has already been secured. Money for future...
That will be in the next SR.
Because we'll be bidding for all the money in next SR for whatever comes on stream.
I understand that, Okay. Any other questions from colleagues in relation to the estimates side of things? Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you. If we think of anything, we'll come back. Thanks for finding that figure. Yes, Dr. Mullen. Yeah,
Before
sorry.
we move on to the...
Yeah, coming in.
Obviously, most of our focus today is on things that are in the annual report, but I just wanted to pick up on the discussion we had last time you were here, Mr. Murray, about what I think is an absence of the report. You remember perhaps last year I raised that whilst it talks a lot about access to justice and the victim's experience, it didn't at all talk about whether you're delivering justice in a more tangible way, and you said at that meeting you go away and have a think about it. It's the same again this year. It's a complete absence of anything about the quality of justice. So absolutely there's stuff in there about access to justice and speed of justice, but it kind of assumes that when you get to court you get justice. So did you manage to do any thinking on that? And if you haven't, why not? And do you still, do you think it's an absence? Because I certainly do, but you may think differently.
So a couple of things, and then I'm going to ask Nick to come in. The answer is yes, we did consider it. And in fact, I think I wrote to the committee after we appeared last year on some of the work we were doing on that. So Nick can update on that. The other thing, just by way of a reminder, and I know we had this conversation last year, is I really do believe, because we got into a conversation, did we not, about process versus substance, and I really do hope and believe that some of the work that we've been doing to continue to develop the data dashboards, albeit it's measuring timeliness, and I understand that's not the same as asking victims how they felt about the outcome, which I know is the focus of your question. Nonetheless, that the capturing timeliness and capturing victim attrition, I think is a really good way of demonstrating whether victims were content or not with the process, because obviously a victim who walks away from the process during the process is by definition almost certainly not content. So I think all the work that we've been doing to develop that and develop the data also contributes to the point you've raised. But if I may, I'll pass to Nick.
Just before you move on, it wouldn't be for me to dictate the only way you can do this is the survey, and you're correct, you kind of gave your views on a survey, but just if you, as a member of the public, to sit and read that annual report, however you wanted to choose to describe it, there is again no discussion of what probably most taxpayers think is a key outcome for you, which is delivering justice for victims. And not being prescriptive about how you do that, but to just not even talk about it. I mean, there's more in the report about climate change than there is about how victims feel about justice, and I think it's another, it has the potential to reflect thinking in the department potentially.
Look, thank you, Dr. Mullen. I welcome the point. I completely agree. It's absolutely essential, and I think what you're saying to me is, without being prescriptive, in next year's annual report accounts,
articulate something.
Can something be articulated? And I very much agree with that. And if helpful, can I also ask Nick to say a little bit about what we've done? Great.
I think it's just worth saying, in respect of the courts, obviously that is their function to provide access to justice largely. We have published some more information over the course of the last period about that. So in relation to our reform programme, we committed to doing some access to justice assessments. And in November last year, we published the first 4 of those. And there'll be 2 more coming in the autumn. And what they effectively outline is how people experience our reform services and whether that has any impact on people of different groups being able to access services. And I think they're now publicly available. And broadly speaking, what they show is that by and large, our reform services do not adversely impact most groups, with a couple of exceptions, and in fact many groups find their access to justice in fact enhanced by the ability to conduct proceedings either more quickly because the process is better, or virtually, for example. There are a couple of areas that we're watching very closely. We'll probably touch on probate later, and we may indeed touch on divorce. And in those areas we have picked up that certain minority ethnic groups find those services more difficult to operate than others, and that is largely for reason of foreign naming conventions and so forth getting in the way. So where we are picking up these issues, we're then fine-tuning the design of our services to meet them. I should also just say that we've been doing quite a lot to gather information, and we have in fact gathered quite a lot of information, including we've surveyed now 600,000 people who've been in contact with the courts, our reform services, over the last period, and that gives us a much richer view of what's going on, and again, largely it's a good news story.
Okay. Not to diminish that really excellent work, which is very important. I think, as Mr. Moreira kind of picked up, my concern is that you could have a system that's really, really well accessed and people think it's a fantastic experience and they still don't think it delivers justice in terms of the outcomes that are delivered for perpetrators. So great stuff, but my point is really not about that. Okay, thank you.
I just perhaps one other flag of something that we're doing, of which the committee will be well aware, is of course the introduction of the Victims and Prisoners Bill is a very important contribution to that, because of the number of things that it does to enshrine the Victims Code and to improve it's aimed at improving the experience of victims in the criminal justice system. So again, another example of lots of work being done, but I take your point that response to it in the annual report is also going to be helpful.
Thank you.
Just one final thing before I hand on. MOJ is an unprotected department, and it has been throughout sort of my time pretty much in the House. And since we had the idea of protected or unprotected departments at any rate. Who knows what tomorrow brings in terms of pressures for spending reductions anywhere within the budget and so on. What contingency arrangements have you made to try and identify areas where you might have to cope with additional pressures on your budgets?
Well, I strongly suspect we will have to cope with additional pressures, because not only are we, as you say, an unprotected department, but we are also a department on who the demand is increasing, not decreasing, because of flows into the system. There are but I should say on some particular areas, and we might come on to those, we have already been fortunate with the Treasury working with them to identify some extra money that might help on certain things. So you might have seen that the justice system as a whole has been awarded 170 million over the next 2 years, I think it is, on the product as part of the productivity plan, the new money announced yesterday. So there's some specific things. That's about digitising packs for jury, and it's about that we can more automation in some things that we can do and support for probation. So there are some particular areas where we have had additional money through these mechanisms. We obviously have to look all the time at our budget, and these involve really difficult choices. And we're doing that at the moment in the context of the allocations for next year, so 24-25. We're currently in the process of allocations. I mean, it's worth noting 41% of our cost base is staffing, 9% is property, 13% are contracts, 17% is legal aid. There are large areas of funding which are not discretionary. And so, because if you're running a system like a prison system or a court system, and although you want to make it as productive as possible, nonetheless, there's a certain cost attached to that. There are areas of discretionary spend, but those are areas with some of the most important spending. For example, money on reducing rehabilitation and reducing reoffending, money on to support for victims, the ISVAs, the IDVAs, all of that work. So it's very difficult in a budget like ours to find places to go. But I just want to re-emphasise that we are doing everything we can to become more productive and more efficient. And a good example of that is, even while Amy, and she might want to say more about this, is increased, obviously recruiting, has recruited almost an additional 5,000 staff to the front line to support on prisons and probation, is nonetheless, as a result of the efficiency and reform process, is taking £37 million out of headquarters of HMPPS overall, through becoming more productive. So we're doing everything we can to be as productive as possible, to make every pound of taxpayers' money work. There's a lot that we have to do with that money.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, X amount you can save through productivity, but you're not only an unprotected department, you're also a downstream department, as you say, so you can't control the flows of demand onto you.
Exactly right.
And essentially you're having to do more with less.
Yeah, just to add a bit to the 1HMPPS programme, because we might talk about that a bit later in another context. I mean, that's exactly right, exactly as the Pen Sec said. One of the areas where I have no discretion and I won't change any spending is frontline staff. And in order to protect frontline staff and make sure that we are doing everything we can to protect them and support them, we've decided to resize headquarters, and that's where the money is coming out of.
Okay, Mr Timpson.
Thank you, Chair. Can we just focus on it for a few moments on that 41% cost base, which is clearly a large part of making your productivity pay dividends, and that's around staff. And in particular, their own experience as MOJ staff, wherever they happen to be. Just before we look at that more generally, can I just ask something that was touched on before, which was about the one-off cost of living payment that was made to civil servants, including probation. So just for clarity, Prison service staff weren't given that £1,500 one-off cost. So could you just explain why that is? I think you did mention something around contracts before and how their employment is coordinated, but what is the reason?
Sorry, the contract would be separate arrangements. So anyone who delivers our services under contract, their pay will be decided by their own employer rather than by us. The reason our own staff that we directly employ in prison didn't get it is because they're under the Prison Service Pay Review Body. So that is decided totally separately by an independent group. We obviously implemented those pay awards, and it was an award of 7% for that year. So it's just a separate remit group decided independently by the pay review body.
Okay, and you followed essentially what the pay review body had recommended. Okay.
Would it be helpful to add to that? So, as Amy said, there's two different. Most staff, including probation, are governed by the civil service pay remit. That was the pay remit that set the award for most civil servants, but then in addition decided to give this one-off non-consolidated payment, which is separate. You normally expect pay review bodies essentially to bear in mind things like cost of living when they're making their awards. As it happens, the PSPRB, the Prison Service Pay Review Body award, was greater than the award for civil servants as a whole. And as Amy said, that was implemented in full, which we tend to do because of the no strike arrangement. And on the other side, on the civil service pay remit, we follow what everyone else is doing on the civil service pay remit.
Just looking at the experiences of staff and how you get sort of feedback on how they are faring under the auspices of the department. There's a survey that's done every year, a civil service survey, you'll be aware of it, and part of what the key indicator that looked at around that is around response rates. And if we home in on, again, the prison and youth custody staff, they, in the survey for 2022, had a response rate of just 28%, which was very low compared with the average across civil service, including within MOJ itself. And in the annual report, the reason for that was described as being due to, a quote, technical barriers, resourcing pressures and negative sentiment from recognised trade unions. So the first question is, what are those negative sentiments? What do they relate to? And how is the department addressing those concerns raised by trade unions in relation to that? Do
you want to do PSPRB? And then I'll do the border. POA.
Yeah, of course. So, first of all, a couple of things I just want to say is that our overall response rate was 41% and probation was above 60%, which is actually a really good response rate for a big geographically dispersed ops organisation.
We overall being HMPPS.
Yeah. But just coming directly to your question about the prison service, the POA have a mandate, the Prison Officers Association, that they believe that it's too general and it's not specific enough for prison staff. And so they advise their members not to fill in the survey on the basis that they don't think it specifically relates enough to life in prison and it's more generalist for the civil service. We continue to engage in dialogue with the POA about that, and we continue to encourage our staff and the POA to change their stance and to fill in the civil service survey. As you say, it is a good measure, and obviously we want to do our best for staff, and without having the data and the response rate, it is quite difficult.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's a good measure. I just know that there's a survey. And how many years has this been an issue?
Several years, yeah, quite a while.
But it's still unresolved?
It's still unresolved, that's right, yeah.
Can I come in on that?
Yeah.
What are you doing instead if they're refusing to complete the survey?
So we do a lot. We have lots of multiple engagement with the unions themselves, so we actually enjoy a really productive relationship with the POA. Of course, we don't agree on everything, but we do have good relationships with them, the same with the probation trade unions. I also have direct staff engagement groups. I have both a probation one and a prison one. We also have various representatives and the area executive directors, so that's the 7 regions in the country, have their own direct relationship as well. We also have all the formal mechanisms for raising disputes and dealing with them, both formally and informally, as you would expect. So that relationship is a good, productive one. We do differ on our stance on the civil service survey.
Do staff prison officer staff have a direct opportunity to answer the questions that are pertinent, that might not be in the civil service survey, but they could actually, what are the questions that their trade union representatives want to be asked so that staff can respond? And with that direct link, not necessarily through their representatives.
I don't understand the question. I don't think the POA's point is there is like these 5 specific questions that they would like to ask. I think their point is the whole survey is generalist, and it is more akin to a generalist civil servant. It's not designed for the very specific operational environment that we have shift workers, for example.
Could I say something about the survey as a whole and MOJ? So actually this year we had a record response rate across MOJ because we had 47,000 people fill in the survey. So that, and when 47,000 people are filling in the survey, you know what it tells you is going to be relevant and important as to how people feel about working in the organisation. This year, our engagement rate overall, the index figure, went up to 61%, which is a 1 percentage point rise on the previous year. And I just want to say thank you to, well, all the staff who filled it in, but all the staff for what they're doing, because to go up by 1 percentage point, and we actually stayed the same and went up in all the key themes, possibly apart from pay, although I think we did also go up in pay this year, I just think a massive tribute to the purpose-led nature of the work we do and the staff that we have. In particular, what I'm referring to is the latest survey, which is 2023 data, so the 1 percentage point is ahead of what is in the annual report and accounts, which was the previous year. I have read every one of I always read the free text comments that people return. There were 32,000 free text comments this year, and reading those gives you a really good indication of what people are concerned about. And what I then do is pick my 3 things that I'm focusing on, that I personally want to make a push on across the department. And the whole of the top team, all directors and above in the Ministry of Justice, have their 3 things that they're focusing on. And my 3 things last year were pay, career development and learning and development. And I'm glad that we went up, in fact we did go up in pay because we went up by 3 percentage points in whether people feel satisfied with their pay. Now I've got to say it's still at a very low level of around 28%, but nonetheless there was an improvement. There was a 2 percentage point improvement in whether people feel they can develop their careers in the Ministry of Justice, and there was a 4 percentage point improvement on whether people feel that they can get access to the right learning and development opportunities. And this year I've just read through, that was for the previous year's 30,000 free text comments. This year I've just read the ones from the most recent survey, and I'll be setting I've set already my 3, I'm happy to tell the committee my 3 priorities. And the key point about this is I really believe that the staff need to feel that the leadership really understand what they're concerned about, and then we're doing the things and we're spending our senior bandwidth time focusing on the things that will make them feel motivated to work in the ministry because of the importance of the work we do and for delivering for the citizen.
Is staff turnover something that comes up?
Well, obviously I focus on staff turnover quite a lot, although actually, as you'll see on from the annual report and accounts, it is improving. It's obviously an issue, but it is improving overall, and we need to. I think it's gone up in some areas, but it's gone down. It's sort of flat or gone down in a number of areas in the department.
Could I turn specifically in relation to that
to
HMCTS, and maybe Mr. Goodwin would want to come in on this, where the civil service average again on staff turnover is 11.9%. We'd expect sort of anything around about 10% in an organisation is not unusual, but it was noticeable in HMCTS that it was at 16%. So really it would be helpful to understand what are the reasons that people are giving at their exit interviews for leaving HMCTS, and what are you doing to try and remedy perhaps where there's a pattern which is unpalatable to the department, where you think you could actually have better retention?
So the headline figure of 16%, that applies to all staff. Within HMCTS, we've had a slightly odd staffing profile over the last few years, and that's a result of a few issues. We took on more staff during COVID and to help us recover the backlogs, for example. That means that we have a higher number of agency staff in HMCTS during the period that we're talking about than we would usually have, and that's because we've anticipated that as we reform our services and become more efficient, we would effectively lose some staff, and therefore made sense to take people on as agency staff to reduce costs down the line. And also when we were looking to recruit staff to help us run tech and so forth during COVID, it made sense to get them in quickly as agency workers. So what we're seeing is, if we have a look at the permanent members of staff within HMCTS, that attrition rate, that turnover rate is much lower. It's 12.7%. and that is clearly closer to what we would want. That also is important to know that we've also quite intentionally over the last period tried to change that balance of staff so that we are taking agency staff and allowing them to become permanent staff, and we are having more permanent staff because it gives us greater stability, there's less training and so forth. So the numbers tell some of that story when you disaggregate agency staff and permanent staff. Nevertheless, we do have a turnover of permanent staff in this year of 12.7%. We also have a great many staff who stay with us 40, 50, 60 years, which is absolutely fantastic. Now, some turnover is fine and to be expected. We are, as Antonia says, focusing on trying to increase people's engagement level. And our engagement scores have stayed actually remarkably steady and basically improved throughout the last few years. That's pretty remarkable, actually, given the amount of hard work people had to deal with COVID and in light of reform. So it's not a bad picture. But we do need to be focusing on people's learning development, as Antonia says, and we are doing that within HMCDS, with particular focus on really important cohorts of staff like legal advisors that we have discussed here before. In terms of why they are leaving, we do exit surveys. And there is some unhappiness with pay, and that is reflected in those exit surveys where 45% of those leaving report pay. They may be leaving to other government departments, by the way, and it's worth noting that we lose many of our staff to HMRC, DWP and others.
You get them coming in the other direction?
We do get them coming in the other way, and I'm not sure if DWP colleagues will watch this. Quite a lot leave and wish they'd stayed, but that's the nature of life in the public sector. So.
What I'm trying to understand is what sits behind what you would want to present as a credible workforce plan within the department. And although accepting that COVID played some havoc around trying to keep abreast of some of those very rapid changes and trying to increase staff, often on a temporary basis, to fill the necessary gaps which opened up. In the 2023 figures, in terms of efficiency savings in the workforce, there were 668 exit packages, which at a cost of £28 million. So in terms of a reduction, but also at the same time, there was, as it happens, an increase in spending on temporary labour of £28 million. So taking on board Mr Goodwin's point around HMCTS and trying to make a more permanent workforce, not relying on agency staff, how is the workforce plan going to try and address some of that sort of movement around the workforce that actually isn't providing you the savings that you're looking for?
Well, thank you. I might bring in Amy in a minute because the majority of the MOJ exit packages actually relate to HMPPS. So in terms of actual exit, in terms of overall money and the contingent workforce, so essentially in an organisation of our size, as you'd expect, we need to run a balanced approach with we do use contingent labour when we are boosting a particular area and we don't expect to need over the long term all of those staff, or when we have to buy in specialist skills which we don't think are going to be available on a permanent basis as easily or in such a cost-effective way. So good examples would be Nick, as he said, has increased the number of contingent workers that he's had during the reform programme, because obviously part of the way of getting the benefits out is that not all those staff will be there at the end as well at the start. On Amy's side, she will have a number of contingent workers who are involved in things like the prison supply, the prison build programme, and the supply side, because some of those will be specialists, but also on things like IT and digital functions, we find that we cannot buy in the sort of expertise that we need at the necessarily, well, it's more better value for money to do so through contingent labour than through permanent staff in some cases, partly because of specific projects, partly because of the way the pay scales work. Would it be helpful for Amy to say something about
Because it's the majority of
Yeah.
the people we're talking
Exactly.
about.
Just as the perm sector says, of the 640 efficiency exits, 572, so the vast majority sat with me. All of those are medical inefficiencies. So it's in other words, when we've taken an evaluation of the person and decided that they're just not fit and there would be no reasonable service, you can imagine that's quite a lot higher in my workforce given the nature of the work. That, you know, if people have certain medical conditions, they are unable to continue as a full prison officer or akin.
Is that part of, for me, Chair, just to finish, is that part of trying to improve productivity vis-à-vis headcount, so that you know that each individual is really giving you the most that you can in providing the service that you are required to provide?
Are you referring to exits or choice between contingent workers and permanent staff?
Well, in terms of an overall workforce plan, how do you essentially measure productivity against the number of staff that you have, and to make decisions about who to keep, who to move on?
Just in terms of my individual exit, no, it wouldn't be about productivity. It would obviously be about the organisational need to give full and effective service, but it would be very much about the individual, whether or not we think there is a reasonable prospect of them coming back and giving us full service. Obviously, we care about the person. If we think there is a realistic prospect of them coming back and giving us good service, we'll bring them back. If we think that is not realistic, so for example, damaged knees means you can't do CNR, we might offer them alternative employment, or they might exit the service. But we obviously have an organisational need, so we need to have people who can do full CNR and the correct numbers, but the individual cases are very much made on the individual's needs and whether or not we can bring that person back to full employment.
We could have a long conversation about occupational therapy and all sorts of things, but I'll leave that for another day.
Thanks very much. The department and its agencies hold quite a lot of management information data. Can you just help me, Permanent Secretary? What is the Ministry and the agency's policy on publishing management information?
Well, obviously, publication of any of each information set is done on a case-by-case basis. The preferred route is to use official statistics. So, accredited official statistics or national statistics. But also we hold internally a lot of internal management information. That internal management information is not quality checked to the same level and the same sense of rigour as an official statistic as you would expect. So we've got a whole raft of information. Some of it we publish, and we think it's important. And when we do publish it, as well as having QA'd it, put it through appropriate quality assurance, we also tend to publish a narrative alongside that sets out the limitations of the data and the strengths and so on. And then we also have obviously, as you'd expect in a big operational department, we've got a lot of operational management information, most of which is not published.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Office for Statistics Regulation makes the point that you do about the operational data being in a raw form, but that they're published to meet the public interest for transparent information. But there's if you like, a health check around the quality. So do you achieve that same approach? Publishing whenever possible in the interest of transparency, but with the warning that they're not checked in the same way that the MI would be.
Obviously, I mean, I'll hand over to Nick in a sec, because it's a good example of where we do exactly that.
Yeah.
Obviously, we want to be transparent. Obviously, decisions on what to publish and in what form is a matter for ministers. But, where possible to achieve transparency and where something is can be rigorously assured, I think, in the time frame, then we would look to publish at an appropriate time. I mean, we have a number of things that we publish quarterly, we publish some things annually, etc. So we tend to try and make it coherent, but HMCTS management information is a good example. So, Nick.
Yeah, so one of the things you need if you're going to publish data is for the data to be reliable. So quite a lot of what we've been investing in with our reform agenda has actually allowed us to really improve the quality of our data. Alongside that, there's a greater thirst for our data, and there was particularly a large thirst for data on, for example, how are we getting along with reducing the caseload during the pandemic. And that led to us publishing new management information at that point. Antonia says it's not quite got the full ONS seal, but it was done working with the ONS. We've recently enhanced that further. So we're trying to publish more information that gives a wider view of our system, so not just numbers that people can't understand, but things like satisfaction rates and so forth. So we are, pushing that direction. People always want more information, but it's quite important that it is of a quality, I think.
The Office for Statistics Regulation says this: MI lags, management information lags, are usually small, and data are generally released frequently. For example, they can be released daily or weekly, and can also be released at longer intervals, such as monthly or quarterly. So, fair enough, bit of flex in that. In relation to the probate service, I think I'm right in saying that the management information on the number of cases completed is published with about a 6-week time lag. Any reason why it's 6 weeks as opposed to perhaps some shorter period?
We publish information on probate on a now monthly basis. So
monthly now.
So it is now monthly, and as I said, it's recently been enhanced so that it's got satisfaction rates in relation to customer contact and so forth. I think the important thing is that information is really, really important if you are deeply interested in probate, which you may be, as say, for a charity or so forth.
Precisely, yeah.
And I think the thing to recognise is that between the publication of individual statistics, there's absolutely nothing stopping a proper grown-up conversation between my colleagues running the probate surveys and those very interested, where we can provide them with as much insight as help them to understand the likely flow, for example, of bequests coming to their particular charity and so forth, and that happens. And again, we do try to provide information that is of use to people wherever possible.
Because we're doing an inquiry into the probate service, as I think you know, Mr. Goodwin, and one of the concerns raised with us is by the charities who do have an interest, because a lot of their income comes from bequests that are left in people's estates, and their concern is that the lack of complete and timely information makes it difficult for them to make robust financial forecasts, because they have staff, they have expenditure that they have for their charitable purposes, but they're sometimes in difficulty with that because they don't know where the incomes are. What discussions have you had specifically with the charity sector around this?
There are good discussions going with the charity sectors and also the lawyers that, specialist legal practitioners who are interested in probate, and they happen regularly. So I know those conversations have happened where we've tried to provide information that allows exactly for that forecasting. So, yeah.
Are they satisfied yet? I don't think they are yet, are they? Are you continuing those discussions? You'd agree it's a legitimate concern that they have?
So, I mean, I'm sure they would always like more and better. I'm very happy to give them, the best information we can. I mean, I think we feel that they are satisfied. We had good conversations with practitioners recently on how we're turning around service and probate and about our call answering time and so forth. And we thought that was a constructive conversation. But,
All right. One thing that in particular, in the course of those constructive conversations, have you got any progress on ensuring that when you publish details as how many cases are outstanding, what the backlog may or may not be, that includes cases which are declared dormant and not being progressed by HMCTS, because that's an issue that's been raised in some of the evidence to our inquiry, that including that will be extremely helpful to those charities.
I recently wrote to the committee because the probate inquiry is coming up. We're giving our evidence on probate.
Yes.
And within that, we have been gone through all the data showing what the caseload is and how that is now rapidly reducing. In fact, we've also been clear on what we think the number of workable cases are in the system, and what we've done is we've recently updated what we assess to be workable cases, i.e. cases which haven't been stopped for reason of further information to be given, yes, to make that a more accurate picture of what's going on. And in essence, what we've done is we've added into that stock of cases some older, typically paper cases, yes, that would have gone unregistered before, and we are just trying to be as accurate as possible.
Okay. Any other questions on the probate side of MI? Mr. Daly.
I'm trying to think of an adequate word to describe what you've just said in terms of the discussions with the legal profession, because I think they're non-existent. And I'll give you one example in respect to that, is that the probate registry recently decided that one day a week, it wouldn't, I think it was the afternoon or one day a week, I think it was each afternoon, they wouldn't be answering the telephone because they were tackling the backlog. Now, no legal practitioner in the country knew that was going to happen. So I just wonder how practical things like that, given at very short notice, is an example of you speaking in a productive manner with legal professionals.
So that is a change that came in the middle of April. And that was a change that was discussed with a number of practitioners before we brought it in. Admittedly, not with a lot of notice, but it was discussed with them. And in fact, we found the reception to that change to be more positive than we thought it would be. And I think it's worth emphasising why we've made that change. So we haven't had the greatest performance in probate for a period of time. We've begun to turn that round really rather quickly since around summer of this year. We're now granting more grants of probate than we ever have done on record. And we're turning that round. And by August next year, we expect to be exactly where we want to be with grants of probate. However, we are facing the fact that over the last year, we've had more requests for grants or more applications than ever before since 2012. So over 300,000 in that year. And that follows off the back of 2 other really high years. At the point of about now, February, 2-3 months hence, we're entering the peak demand period. And what we wanted to do was make sure that we could preserve our recovery in terms of getting grants of probate out the door. And that is best done by limiting those phone lines and having people deal with the grant of probate, because many of those calls are people chasing for progress. And so the best service we can give is actually to get the job done for those people. And that restriction of the phone lines to the morning of the day has actually resulted in us being able to maintain that trajectory. The duration people wait for calls has reduced, and generally speaking, it's enhanced public service.
I can understand why you're saying that, but the service, the probate registry, has been given has been a disaster over the last few years. And there is not. When you're saying I've spoken to a few practitioners regarding what's going on, it must be a very few, because just about every practitioner in the country did not know at very short notice that the changes were going to come. So, I mean, in terms of can you just explain to me why you think that the timescale for the issuing of probate certificates increased from 14 days pre-COVID to a minimum of 16 weeks now?
So the 14-day figure isn't entirely accurate. The 14-day figure doesn't include any cases that were stopped. So because we are being more transparent with the data, what you're seeing is averages that include stopped cases. And also the performance is, if we are dealing with a simple case that's coming through our digital system, last year we were able to discharge those within the same period, within about 2 weeks. The difficulty comes when a case is either complicated or comes on paper. And it's true, we have not kept pace with those over the course of the previous year. And what we're seeking to do now is to turn that round. We are turning that round. So
just to start from that, are you telling me seriously that you think the probate registry over the last number of years has been run in an efficient, productive manner? You may be now taking extreme measures to try to get things back online, but it's a complete example of the MOJ losing control over an agency which has not delivered in a timely fashion and continues, for reasons I still don't understand, to have huge delays in what are very, in the past, which have been things have been dealt with in a far more efficient manner.
So the performance has been turned around. I do accept it has not been good enough. The reason why we fell into problems was 2 reasons. One, I've already outlined the fact that we had record levels of demand for probate services. At the same time, we reformed the probate services going back to 2019, and in doing so, we did make the error of not putting certain cases through to our more experienced staff. And therefore there was a problem dealing with paper cases tend to be more complicated, and 1% of cases tend to be very complicated. And we didn't have that capacity to deal with those adequately at a point of time, and that's why we fell behind. But that has now been addressed.
Do you think it's an example of MOJ efficiency, that people are required to send certified documents to a building in one part of the country, whilst the actual probate registry, the officers who are dealing with the application, are sat in a different building completely?
Sorry, can you just say
So in
that?
terms of the documents, the paper documents that you're talking about that are sent through, they are sent through to a separate building for certification before they are then downloaded for the officer to deal with that. Do you think that is an efficient way of this of the probate, efficient use of time in terms of how the probate registry deals with these matters, and how much money is the MOJ spending on paying a company to certify documents when you could simply have solicitors or other professionals certify them for virtually no cost to the MOJ?
So I do think it is a good way of processing the documents. Many of those documents are sent in physical form and then effectively bulk processed onto our digital systems. When something is on a digital system, we can then handle it much more quickly than if it is a paper copy. So this is for that reason that documents come in that way, and I think there are really, really good opportunities to make that, if you like, digital processing even better, even smarter, which will improve the service further. The subsequent question about why don't solicitors deal with those cases?
Well, if you're sending something, you're actually paying a firm to certify documents as true and correct copies of whatever it is that's been sent in.
So the application probate would still need to be seen by the probate service. So it still need to be sent in, i.e. submitted by a solicitor.
You're asking people to send documents to A, to then go through a process which then send documents to B, where they consider those documents, whereas you don't need to have A, you don't need to send the documents there. There are a whole load of professionals who could certify the documents which the probate registry rely on as accurate copies.
The probate service still needs to validate in order to be able to grant.
So what do they do that solicitors couldn't do?
Sorry?
What do they do? You're paying a huge amount of taxpayers' money to an organisation to verify documents. What is that organisation doing that solicitors couldn't do?
They're either uploading the documents digitally, or they are distributing them, if they need to be looked in a physical form, to the various probate registries. That's what they're doing. They're not doing legal work on them. So that is done by our probate staff. Our probate staff will look at the document and see whether a grant of probate can be granted. That is their function.
Yeah, I could ask numerous questions on probate, but
we go over some time. I'm sure we all.
Yeah.
But I suppose the point might be this, Mr. Goodwin, that the solicitors are bound by professional obligations to be truthful. Therefore, if they certify that the documents are true and accurate, they're giving their professional word that they are true and accurate. But why do you need to pay out for another firm to second-guess them?
Well, they're doing completely different jobs. So a solicitor can't grant probate. The grant of probate can only be done by the court and therefore our probate staff. So
Do you have one more go, Mr. Daly? Because this is
the point is this: is that for the documents that are downloaded to the probate registry, the officers are considering those are documents that, in general, they can be done by the individual or a executor themselves, but they tend to come from legal firms. All we are suggesting is that to be a more productive service and to save the taxpayer a fortune, you go to the solicitor, you go to the legal representative. They are duty bound if they do not feel that is a correct document not to certify. But if it's certified as a true and original copy of a financial document, why not just allow them to do that? Download it straight to the officer and cut the third party out completely. The role they are doing doesn't serve any purpose. It increases delays and costs the taxpayer a fortune for no reason.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I follow that. I don't think I accept that because if you're
it's an outsourced service to scan the documents. It's not. Is it not? It's not the legal bit, isn't it?
Yeah. Certain documents are bulk processed by a provider and therefore scanned onto our digital system, or someone applies for probate digitally themselves, and that is how we get documents into the probate service that are then examined by our staff to see whether they can grant probate. Solicitors can apply for probate, and quite often do, and solicitors, by the way, also make mistakes when applying for probate that have to be corrected by our staff. I don't quite follow why sending more documents to solicitors reduces part of the process. If they have to upload those documents and send them in to us, then presumably they will charge a fee on top of the probate fee that's already charged at other professional fees. So I don't quite see what the efficiency is here.
Even if you take it, I'm sort of going around in circles a little bit here, but just one final thing. Even if Miss Hopkins is right, let's just say that it's not about certifying. Let's just say that it's about scanning them into the system. Why would you employ a firm, let's take that interpretation, to literally download documents onto a system? Why wouldn't you expect the person who's applying for probate download them straight.
We do. So you can apply for probate yourself without the help of any solicitor, and you can provide the information. That's you can do that.
This is for those people who can't send it in, for whatever reason they don't send it in digitally. There needs to be a system that uploads it digitally.
So yes, if documents have to be sent in and examined physically, then they go somewhere and then they're sent to other people. They're either scanned in digitally so people can deal with them digitally, or in certain cases, if it's particularly complicated and must be dealt in paper, they are effectively collated and sent out to those probate registers who will deal with it. But there's no other process, if you like, that occurs within that would benefit, I think, particularly from a solicitor's intervention at that point, unless I'm missing something. And if a solicitor did intervene at that point, then rather than it being part of the probate fee, the solicitor would presumably be charging another fee on top of the probate fee and on top of any professional fees that they may charge. And I think it is also worth emphasising that, by and large, the digital service works incredibly well for people. Digital service has got a really, really high satisfaction rate. I think it's in the early 90%, and for simple cases, it works very well. People can self-serve. And often, as I say, we receive documents, even from solicitors, that may need correcting. So I'm sorry, I'm very happy to discuss outside the room.
I think the point that we're trying to say to you is you've got a hugely inefficient, costly service which is not delivering a service which is anywhere near acceptable. And any amount of statistics that you can give to us today doesn't go away from that fact. And we are just suggesting that there are ways of saving the taxpayers' money and having a more efficient service. And that's one of the examples of it. And we shouldn't run away from the fact that this is a basket case of a service. There may be some progress that's being made in respect of it, but it is a terrible service where legal practitioners confirm to us as a committee it is a terrible service. And you've had to take the dramatic step of not answering the phone to actually clear the backlog. So, we are just concerned about that. And when we visited the probate registry, they were very open about the challenges that are being faced. So,
it might be worth, perhaps, Secretary, that somebody is tasked up within the department or HMCTS of reading all the evidence that's been submitted to our inquiry, which is on our website, and perhaps get a measure of the issues that are being raised, and then that might enable us to find a constructive way forward.
Yeah, good. I mean, I'm sure we're very happy to do that. It sounds as though there's a kind of workflow issue here about exactly who's doing what at which point in the system. So if helpful, we should set out the workflow. We could additionally submit that.
Thank you very much.
All right, great. Thank you.
Timson.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to offer some light relief, but we're going to turn to the 2020 spending review, and in particular the £4 billion investment that came out of that for Ministry of Justice on the prison expansion programme. We're now in 2024, and I believe about 2.3 billion of that 4 billion has been spent, so over half. That's created 5,600 new prison places out of the target of 20,000 additional places. So that does beg the question that we need to ask around whether the amount that's been spent so far represents good value for the taxpayer.
I mean, well, I'll start and Amy will say some things about whether or not it does. I mean, as you say, we've actually now, I think, built 5,900 new places as part, and by the end of 2025, we expect to have 10,000 new places as part of that programme. As you'll be aware, there have been some movement to the right on some of those big prison build programmes due to planning, and Amy will say more about that in a minute. But we've got a really strong track record actually of delivering on time and budget when planning permission has been received. We had Five Wells and Foss Way have both opened. We've got Millsite coming next year. We've got a number of house blocks and 2 more to come before 2025. We've got hundreds of rapid deployment cells that I've talked about before at this committee, with hundreds more to come. So there's a huge amount ongoing. Have I answered your question?
Well, it's trying to understand, with over half the budget already spent and still around 14,000 short of the target, which was meant to be 2025, which Minister Arger did admit last time that he doesn't anticipate that happening. Clearly, we're probably going to get to the halfway point if things go to plan. But of course, there are, as you've alluded to, issues like planning delays, but also construction costs. Seen a significant rise since the pandemic of around about 34% around raw materials on its own, as well as labour costs on top of that. So within the budget that you've been allocated, significant budget, are you still under the sort of strong impression that you are going to be able to build business cases for each of these expansion programmes and prison bills which are viable, bearing in mind those price rises within the construction industry?
So the answer to the question is yes, and two points, and then I know Amy will want to come in. The money we were given was the money we were given during this SR. It wasn't to pay for all of the places, because inevitably we were only given money for what we were given SR 21 for the what work needed to happen and the money we needed in that period. So the money we've spent, we expect to need more money, a lot more money in the next SR. So it's not the case that we've spent more than half of the money without more than half of the places, if that makes sense. The second point to say is obviously it's not linear. So you do a huge amount of money. I mean, a lot of the work that has been done, for example, on rapid deployment cells is looking at the design. We've done a lot of design work on those rapid deployment cells to ensure that we can see where we can use them, and Amy will say more about the sort of cohorts that can go into those, so the appropriate level of risk. But the point is, you have to do a lot. That it's not kind of linear in terms of building one place. You have to do a lot of design work. There's a lot of site work, and then the map, if you like, of getting the places on stream comes in chunks.
Okay, just before Amy comes in, I think what I'm driving at is when you had the spending review settlement in 2020, the anticipation then, the projection was that by 2025 you've had 20,000 new prison places. We're just over a quarter of that, getting close to the wire. So what was the 4 billion when it was first allocated meant to deliver, as opposed to what has been delivered?
So you can see, well, it wouldn't have delivered all of those places because, of course, it would only have gone up to, for this spending round. But you're right that the planning permission delays on 3 of the 6 new build prisons has significantly delayed the programme, and therefore not been great news from the point of view of value for money of the programme. Because obviously slippage, when you've done a lot of the work, is not a good thing, especially because, to the point you've already made, supply chain shocks, we're very valuable to supply chain shocks, and we're also very vulnerable, and we're also very vulnerable to inflation, related and other types of inflation. So as a result, it gets more expensive to build the more you slip. So you are correct that those planning delays, and of course now we do have planning permission now for 2 of those 3, which is good news, but the fact that we didn't get planning permission earlier and we had to go through the appeal process has increased the cost of the programme. The final point to make is, of course, as what you also expect getting at, is that, as you'll see, part of the money that we have on the capital side that we have underspent was to do with the prison build programme, precisely because, and this is not loss of value, this is reprofiling in years, largely to do with planning.
What is the current, bearing in mind, of course, some of the variables that we can't foresee completely, everyone from the OBR downwards and upwards doesn't get projections right, but based on your current projections, to reach your 10,000 figure by 2025, how much additional funding is going to be required? And then subsequent to that, to get to your 20,000 figure, what are you going to be asking for to try and make sure that you can deliver this programme in full?
Well, I actually think to deliver within, I think we will be able to, well, and Amy will correct me if I'm wrong, deliver within the amount of money we were given originally, what we now will be able to do by 2025, because essentially, although it's become more expensive per place and per prison and per house block and per cell, the overall, because of the slippage due to planning permission, we therefore will have the money to pay for that. So I don't think we're going to have to go back for more money this SR, but I do think we will need, obviously, a lot more money for the next SR for what will be 3 new prisons that we'll be bringing on stream in the next SR. But I can feel that both Amy and James would like to say something.
I mean, just 2 things I want to add. As the Perm Sec has said, and if you've rightly called out, there's no doubt that from the beginning of this programme to now, costs have gone up to build the same thing. It's quite considerably more than it was when we started, for all the reasons that have been discussed. The other thing I guess I just wanted to call out is, I guess, implicit in your question is value for money, and how do we consider that? Now, we talk a lot about the big prisons, but lots of our building is small buildings, small secure house blocks, additional house blocks, things that we drop in. We have a prioritisation framework that we go through quite rigorously that tries to have a value for money. We try to weigh up geographical location, the cohorts that are needed, the category of the prison that will deliver, how quickly we can deliver it, and we have a prioritisation framework that we're looking all the time to try and secure the best value for money. James, if you want to...
Yeah, just to agree, I think we have the cash flow for this SR, to your point, Permanent Secretary. For the next SR, it'll be part of our conversation with Treasury. We need to look carefully at the timing. We've still got one large new prison to where we haven't got planning permission secured. We need to look at other slippage, and that will have a really significant impact on what the total cost of finishing the programme will be. So I don't have a figure today to say, and I wouldn't want to play out our sort of conversation with the Treasury in this way either, but it is going to cost significantly more to finish the programme when we started this sort of SR20, but that is common for all infrastructure. This is not unique to the prison build programme. So the inflationary headwinds that we've seen, the supply chain constraints, it's the same for us as it is for road building, hospital building, school building, and we're in the eye of that storm as well. And so that'll be for the next spending review to help resolve.
Final points for me, Chair. The committee did visit 5 wells a month or so ago, and whilst there were lots of good things that we discovered there, speaking to prisoners and prison staff, it was also clear that there are some aspects of the build which haven't quite gone to plan. For instance, air ventilation was an issue on some of the buildings. So how are you ensuring that some of these builds that you still have ahead of you are going to sort of be better future-proofed for the demands that are going to be placed on them?
Thanks. I think we covered some of this a bit last time when we met, didn't we? That I think we've got a really rigorous system for learning lessons from new builds. I think we talked particularly about, we actually moved the manager who helped to open Berwyn to move to open the 5 wells and Foss Way.
We met him, yeah.
We really are trying to learn. So, we had some issues with Berwyn that we haven't repeated in 5 wells and Foss Way, but no doubt we'll learn some of those things for some of our new prisons coming on. So we have a rigorous, proper lessons learnt, and that is both from the constructors, but also from the staff that are going to run the place and the prisoners, who have their own feedback. And
just finally, with opening new prisons comes the requirement for more staff to ensure that the prison capacity that we need can be fulfilled. So whether this is a live discussion or not, I don't know, but what commitments have you had or are you seeking from His Majesty's Treasury for additional funding to ensure that you have the staffing that you need and the level and experience of staff that you need to make those prisons successful institutions?
So, obviously, it's the next SR, as you've referred to, so it'll be part of our overall bid. But what's quite clear is, because we're already talking as we get planning permission, the Treasury are well aware that when we begin an infrastructure programme, although we might not have all the money in this SR, we're going to need to build the prison, and then we're also going to need to staff up the staff for those prisons, but also then resulting probation staff. There's a whole flow. So all of that will be part of the conversations that we'll be having with the Treasury as part of the next spending round.
Shall I particularly pick up your question on those experience, which I guess is a slightly different category of question? And certainly our experience, for example, of opening Foss Way was quite different from 5 wells. So we were able to staff Foss Way more easily, the provider there, than we were in 5 wells. Some of that is hyper-local in terms of, what other employers there are in the region. Some of it is good lessons about planning and how far out in advance that you start. We do also require a kind of minimum base where we move experienced staff to open a prison, and then we have others. Even so, cannot extol the virtues of new prisons more to you, as opposed to trying to run old Victorian buildings. But that is to be separated from the challenges of opening a new prison, which is actually a really challenging thing to do, because we bring together a prisoner cohort for the first time, and as you can all appreciate, prisons are pretty delicate ecosystems, so opening a new prison is tricky, even with experienced staff.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much. Mr. Daly, back to you.
You apologise.
Looking at common platform.
In terms of the common platform, I think it originates in 2016, and it has had a budget which I think is now at around £1.3 billion. Forgive me. Can I just ask how you feel that programme has gone and developed, and whether it's been a success?
So I'll start, if
yeah, of course,
right, and then bring in the Chief Exec, Nick. Overall, obviously, we've just done quite recently, we've done a lessons learned, because as you'll be aware, because Nick wrote to the committee, we've had a refresh and been having a look at the timelines. And I think it's fair to say that this is an incredibly complex programme. I think last time I was here, I described it as trying to rebuild the jet plane while flying it at the same time. I think there were a number of things that we have learnt through the course of the programme. The three which most stick out to me. One is, I think, the complexity, the ambition and the vision were there, which were good, but I think we underestimated the complexity of the programme and how we planned to roll out too much too quickly. Secondly, I think we underestimated, and this couldn't have been known at the outset, but we underestimated what the pandemic would do to the running of the system and to the rollout of some of the things. There were obviously some things that as it happened, the pandemic made easier to do, including things like the video platform and so on. But actually, it put a lot of delays in the system, and I think recovery took a lot longer than we had anticipated. And thirdly, and you'd expect me to say this, is the listening to feedback on the system. And I think that is something that's significantly improved since we were talking about it last time we were in front of the committee. So in terms of how well it's doing, I think it's lessons learned. I mean, I think the Lady Chief Justice said to this committee that she didn't see it as a single programme. She saw it as a process of continuous improvement. And I think some bits have been quite successful and other bits are still in process. And obviously what we want to do is learn the lessons and bring it into land in a way that significantly improves the way we run the system for all the users. And Nick will want to say more specifically.
I certainly can. The question spoke both about common platform and reform, and common platform is a part of the reform programme. So I'm very happy to talk to either.
Yeah.
Well, I tell you what, probably to help and to sort of take things further, there are three questions which are perhaps a little bit more direct. How many projects are to be completed? How much of the 1.3 billion is left? Is further funding likely? And has the programme represented good value for money?
Okay. So I think that's in relation to the overall reform programme, where the budget is 1.3 million. So at the moment, we think we've delivered for this 5 services, 7 are in the process of national rollout, and 2 are effectively being piloted and therefore will be rolled out over the next year or so. So that's the progress, as Antonia says. Many of the services are working really, really well, and we're working really hard to make sure that the others are implemented really well. We've done a lot more. We've had a lot of learning, as Antonia says, and are getting better, I think, at implementing these changes. So that's where we are. In terms of, I think the second question was around budget and spend. Yeah. So, I mean, we've recently had a look at how we complete the programme, and as Antonia says, what we're really trying to do here is make sure that we get the value out of a modernisation whilst maintaining effectively a smooth operation of the courts, so making sure that there's not too much change in the courts, and what we do supports court recovery rather than pushes against it. So with those changes, we are within the budget. So the budget was the official version of the budget, if you like, was the 2021 business case, known as business case 6. which set a budget of just under 1.3 billion, and we expect to come in within that figure. In fact, if we complete as planned, we may come in slightly under that by about £20 million. So we're not expecting to need more money at this point, and there's some contingency in our planning, although clearly we'd always like a bit more. Once we finish the official reform programme, our services will pass into, if you like, business as usual. Once they become part of business as usual, we'll continue to improve them and enhance them as you would with any mission-critical system. So there'll be further investment down the line, but in terms of completing the programme, we should come in broadly in respect to budget. Does it provide value for money? Yes. I mean, it just does. The lifetime benefits will be greater, if you like. The MVP is good. It's also true without reform, the courts would not have been able to operate as effectively as they did during the pandemic, and we would not have seen really, really good improvements to some of the timeliness. For example, money claims go through,
Could I just one thing on the costs, just to sort of for completeness? Of course, what has happened, as Nick has set out both in his letter and just mentioned, is that because some of the benefits, as we call it, of reform, have met in terms of savings from replacing some processes that were going to be done by staff and digitally, because some of those have moved to the right. If there has been, those have been absorbed. So even when the programme lives within its overall financial cost base, you've also got to look at the benefits that are being delivered. So I just want to be totally clear that I think although we think that the overall cost of the programme will not exceed its budget, what may change is the profile of some of those benefits. So therefore, I suppose the MPV may change.
Because of time, shall I miss out the...
Okay.
Go on to another colleague.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. We dealt with quite a lot around programme. Can I just ask one thing, Mr. Goodwin, around Common Platform, if I may? We learnt just very recently that Common Platform is not going to be extended to Crown Court judges. They're going to continue to use the digital case system. That's provided by an external provider. Why is that?
There's a number of reasons why we've taken that difficult decision. So firstly, as you know, the last time I was before the committee, it was about the time that we had moved to completing implementation of Common Platform into the Magistrates' Court. So we've now got Common Platform in 100% of the courts, but that was a difficult process, and we learned a lot from that. So, and we've since had a PAC report and an AA report. We've been reflecting on those learnings as we've looked to complete the job. And one of those learnings really is that this is an incredibly complicated system. And what we've done so far has been incredibly good, but we need to focus on stabilising Common Platform, making it better in the Magistrates' Court and also as it applies to the Crown Court. And that requires us to invest in basically the technology, bearing down on technical debt and making it ever quicker and ever better. We also had a long look at the programme, and there's two things we wanted to do. The programme also, don't forget, it's the most ambitious in the world, and it covers all of civil, family and tribunals as well. And we could see with what the time and budget we had left to run, that investing in the civil, family and tribunals part of the process would probably have a bigger impact in terms of government efficiency, but also in terms of citizens' experience of the justice system than completing Common Platform that applies in the Crown Court and therefore, relatively speaking, a few number of cases. So we took the decision to cease that, not spend 5 million and 3 years completing Common Platform and invest some of that money in completing the rest of the programme. We could also see that at the moment with the Crown Court absolutely at full tilt, introducing a new system next year was potentially quite risky. It would have required us to train 3,000 judges and advocates on a new system while the Crown Court is absolutely at full flight. And one of the reasons we decided not to progress with this is because that was risky, but also because we know advocates and judges in the Crown Court very much like and are used to our digital case system. And we could see that by enhancing that and joining up with Common Platform, we'd effectively reduce risk and get better bang for our buck. So, broadly speaking, that's it. As Antonia said, what we have given up there is we did expect that would allow us to reduce the number of staff in the Crown Court next year, But to be honest, that reduction, when you're at full tilt in the Crown Court, actually would have been incredibly difficult to land. And that's why we made the change.
Is this an indefinite postponement or for a period of time, or can't you say?
Yes, so it's, we are focusing on enhancing the DCS system in the Crown Court because we think that is the best.
It looks like this is the end of Common Platform being rolled out in the Crown.
So we'll finish off Common Platform.
So that's the end of it. Yeah. Any abortive costs in consequence of terminating the rollout at that stage?
I mentioned that at the beginning. The two elements.
The 5 million, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, the two elements. Sorry.
So at the beginning, you asked me what the potential write-off might be for the two elements we're not proceeding with in the Crown Court, and I said that was around 5.5. Yeah.
That's okay. That's fine. That ties up. Will there be any extra costs that we have to pay out to the external provider of the DCS digital case system?
So, I mean, DCS will need to be maintained over a period of time. So, yes, we will obviously.
But perhaps one that's quantified. You could write us with that.
No, I can't give you that figure now, but it will be ongoing for years to maintain and improve that.
So we can write.
Yeah, perhaps when you've got an estimate going forward, that would be helpful to have save time today. Okay. I understand the reasons, but you should have the transparency about what the upsides are as well as the downsides. That's the downsides as well as the upsides. Okay, Ms. Hopkin.
Thank you. If I can ask about 1HM PPS, can you just give me an outline? What's the purpose of 1HM PPS? What's its full financial costs and how those costs are being met?
Yeah, of course. So two sides to 1HM PPS, and I think we talked about that a little bit at the beginning. One is to make sure we right-size headquarters and it's fully focused on serving the front line. It's actually overall, the programme's going to save us 37 million. And then the other side is to introduce area executive directors. So they are the 7 regional leads who will oversee both probation and prisons in their region. We're not making probation officers into prison officers. They are still separate entities, but it's trying to manage the handoff between the two and make sure we've got really local responsive decision making.
So we've seen in some of the recent inspection and some of the feedback is that probation's significantly under-resourced, understaffed, sorry. In fact, some of the recent staff interviews as part of that inspection, staff were saying that their workload, over 60% said their workloads were not so or not at all manageable. So how will the 1HM PPS contribute to improving workloads, the effectiveness, efficiency of the probation service?
Shall I just talk to you about what we're doing about that in general and about trying to make the probation service as best as it can be? So first is absolutely in investing in staffing, and we have done really well on that in the last few years. So we've had 4,000 PQIPs, that's probation officers under training recruited, that's a record number. We've invested £155 million in the probation service. We also went up nearly 10%, 9.9% in 1 year on staffing levels. So we're really trying to make the big investment. Of course, if you make the investment of staffing, what we hope that will do is drive down workload, which we absolutely recognise needs to happen. But then we also have to have an investment in quality delivery. And we do recognise that there will be a challenging balance of experience and inexperience because of all that recruitment that we have now got to get right. So we're doing things like investing in seeds, which is essentially a framework for how we engage. So it's like a quality improvement framework for how the probation officer engages with the offender. And also, as the PermSec mentioned up front, we got some money in the productivity review to really improve our digital systems for things like risk management, because one of the things probation staff would say to you is they spend quite a lot of time rekeying data, from one system to another. So that investment will really try and help reduce their workload in that respect.
And you mentioned that there's been significant recruitment, and obviously there's a lot of probation staff or trainees and newly qualified. How are they being supported, and is that taking time away from experienced staff to help develop them in their early career?
It's a really good question. It is a challenge, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. So the first thing to say to you is we've done really well on the staffing, but first of all, that's not even. So we've now got some parts of the country like Wales and Greater Manchester that are really pretty much fully staffed, although they still need to work on the balance of experience and experiences we talked about. Other places like London where we still have quite a lot more to do in terms of recruitment. So the first thing to say is it's not uniform. The second is we're then trying to investment in that quality by things like having quality improvement, both agendas and individuals who try and help them, but also an investment in the senior probation officer. So trying to look at how we can do that. For example, in a recent inspection report in Wales, the human factors, which is a real investment in how you invest in the senior probation officer to then help the newly qualified staff, was really called out as being good practice. So we've got a variety of things that we are trying to do. And to answer your question straight, it does take time from more experienced probation officers in order to try and help their colleagues, which is one of the reasons why we've had a kind of profile of how we've recruited probation officers, because we could have in fact even tried to recruit more than 1,500 in some of those years, but the recognition is there is a big requirement to invest in those staff that we recruit, otherwise it will be a wasted investment. So we think there's a kind of limit to how much experienced staff can help our new staff, hence why we've quite carefully tried to profile how we recruit probation staff.
And so a number of reports and stakeholders, including the outgoing Chief Inspector of Probation, recommended the service is more localised for probation and more sort of local governance. How does the 1HM PPS sort of help achieve that?
Yeah, of course. So the second part of 1HM PPS is designed to do exactly that. So it's designed to have a senior leader, area executive director, who oversees both prison and probation, so it can be much more responsive to the local needs. We also have our regional probation directors who are very engaged on a local level. So for example, in Greater Manchester, they're doing lots of work, specific work on domestic abuse perpetrators. That is all run locally and it's led by the regional probation director. So we are trying to move the service as much as we can to having properly locally responsive and engaged. I mean, we are in no doubt that probation works best when it's really engaged with local stakeholders. Having said that, I just want to be really candid and direct that I feel quite strongly that another big change programme would be the last thing probation needs for 3 reasons, and I just want to go over that. One is the investment in staffing that we've talked about. The experience has been that when it was more devolved, that investment didn't happen, particularly in fully qualified staff, and I would worry about that. The second is the digital services, which is quite significant, as we've talked about. And the last thing we'd want, again, is 37 different computer systems trying to talk to each other, which I would worry about. But the third thing is much more human, which is what we really need to do is focus down on quality of practice, as we've sort of been talking about briefly in this session. I fear that another change programme would just mean that, you know, the diversion was taken from where it needed to be, which was a real focus on practice and quality management.
A couple of follow-ups on that. So you don't agree that an independent, with the former chief, or the outgoing Chief Inspector of Probation, an independent review about whether probation should be much more locally governed? You don't agree with that?
I mean, so a couple of things. I mean, Justin Russell's perspective is obviously interesting, given that he, prior to being Chief Inspector, ran one of the incarnations of how we looked at probation services and how we did them. So he's obviously got an interesting perspective. But I'm very clear that another big change programme of that kind would be the worst thing we could do for probation right now.
So I appreciate your frankness. So I'll ask then, how, you know, sort of what steps are you building then to ensure that independence of the probation service from the prison service, you know, because I think there's recognition of different roles, as you said when you first started speaking.
Absolutely. And again, I recognise the concern, because sometimes we have that played back to us. I think it is the complete opposite, in that both myself and Phil Coppell, who's the DG that run Ops, are very clear that we think the best way to get outcomes for HMPPS, i.e. protect the public and reduce reoffending, is actually for probation to take the lead with partnerships, because it's probation who have the relationships with chief constables, it's probation who have the relationship with safeguarding boards locally, etc. And what we really want is for that engagement to be through probation. But equally, as you will appreciate, offender management is an end-to-end system, and we know there are handoffs. So probation are there right at the beginning, make recommendations to court through the PSR, etc. They're also there when they come out of custody at the end, or indeed manage a community sentence if that's what happens. And we need to do as well as we possibly can with the handovers, because we have to manage people at the beginning, right the way through the system, and in the end, both in terms of when they're in custody. So what we're really trying to make sure is that system has much better handoffs, which is why we think managing regionally is the best way we can achieve offender management overall.
Do you understand how NAPO and their members are actually worried about that retention of their professional identity, though, rather than merging it in the process? I can understand the journey of an offender, but actually that professional identity is really important. So while the journey is one thing, what steps are you taking to reassure members that this move to the area director model, it sort of won't undermine some of that?
Well, I totally understand the question, and we're having lots of engagement on that. Like I say, my candid is it's the opposite, is that we would like probation to take a lead. So it's not that we want probation to be kind of overtaken from prisons, far from it. The other thing we're trying to do is invest in the professional identity of probation. So we've had a skills register. We are looking, even if we can, to take that further to a proper independent registry, because I do totally believe that probation is a profession and should be recognised as such. And it is a different profession from running prisons, without a shadow of a doubt. It's just that we have to manage these people right the way through the system, and the handoff should be good. So I don't seek in any way to try and merge or smush the roles of kind of probation and prison. They are different.
Pleased to hear you say they're two separate entities, and I think that comes down to some concerns that you've probably heard about the new area executive director model and the fact they will have an element of autonomy, how that might butt up against sort of established collective bargaining arrangements for the probation profession. Can you kind of give some assurances that that new regional model won't undermine that?
Yeah, I absolutely can. Again, I understand the concern, and you would expect I've been engaged in conversations like this, and I had a good away day with the probation trade unions about all this stuff. There is no change to collective bargaining arrangements. That is the straightforward, candid answer. No change at all.
That's very helpful. I think that's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mullen.
Thank you. I wanted to ask some questions now about self-harm and violence in prisons. So I understand that self-harm in the female prison state is much higher than in the male, approximately 10 times higher in terms of the rate. I just want to understand what you're doing to understand why that is, and if you could share any of your understanding.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the first thing to say is, obviously, we want to drive down self-harm as much as we possibly can. It's also worth probably acknowledging that whilst the rate is up, the number of women who self-harm it's broadly static. It's the number of incidents of self-harm that each individual woman is committing, which is quite important in how we help to manage it. Also, we aren't really aware of any women in the system who self-harm in custody that don't self-harm in the community. So in other words, this is real trauma for which we have to try and deal with. The reason that's so important is it means we have to work in partnership with the NHS and others, because particularly women, as you know, have more shorter sentences, so they move in and out between custody and not. In general terms, though, what we are trying to do is, one, invest in the staffing, a bit like we were saying, two, invest in the regime, because we know a well-run regime reduces the chance of having that. And then three, some specific thing we're trying to do with women. So there's a couple of things. Going back to my NHS point, we're working in partnership to have a really trauma-informed approach and work with psychologists as well as just us. So trying to have an overall system of kind of case management that involves lots of medical professionals as well as prison staff. So we're really trying to make that investment. We're also investing in the early days in custody, the first 28 days, where we know that that's a real issue.
Okay. I'm just interested, as you mentioned those, I think, really insightful statistics. Do you know if it's similar for the male estate? What proportion of male self-harm is new on the estate, do you know?
It's a really interesting question. We're not as clear about it as we are for the female estate, although we know that in general self-harm is more prevalent in society than it's more prevalent with young people, so we can expect to see that turn up in our prison estate. In general, though, levels of trauma are higher amongst women than they are amongst men.
Yeah, okay. And then just on assaults, I think there's been a significant increase on both prisoner-on-prisoner assaults and prisoner-on-staff assaults in the last 12 months. I wanted to understand, whilst there might have been an increase in the last 12 months, what's the historical trend? Is it higher or lower on a historical basis? And why do you think there's been an increase in the last 12 months?
So, look, I'll talk in a minute about what we're trying to do to address it, but I think you know the levels during COVID were artificially low because obviously we were running a very restricted regime, so we have returned to kind of those levels. But
well, have we? Is it just normal pre-COVID levels? Is it higher than that?
We're more or less on pre-COVID levels now, but we would want those levels to be much lower than they are. Same sorts of things, don't want to repeat myself. You've got to invest in the staffing, you've got to invest in a good regime. We have put out a letter to governments recently about starting on the 1st of April, our new regime and how we run those, etc. And then particularly at levels of violence, it's probably worth calling out the work we've done on drugs, which has been quite a lot in terms of our drug-free unit, our incentivised substance-free living unit. And then there's the investment in technology as well, in terms of body-worn video cameras, etc. So a lot of activity, we really do want to drive down those levels.
Okay. You mentioned technology, you mentioned kind of drug-free prisons. I think we might have discussed this before on one of our prison visits, and we had a recent roundtable with governors So the prison visit was a long time ago, but the recent roundtable of governors, they kind of confirmed it was still policy, that you have this great technology for detecting smuggling into prisons, but you don't actually pursue or prosecute people who you find through the scanners are smuggling. There's a kind of a trade-off. It's, well, if you let us have what you've got on you, then that's the end of the matter. And the explanation given is it's an operational challenge to secure police time and CPS interests, etc. But I continue to think that that's, in the long run, not the right decision to take, because you're not creating a moral hazard, a risk for people to do it. If they know, I'll try, if I get caught, I'll give it up, I'll try again next time. Is there something that the MOJ could look at again in trying to, and working with the Home Office and try and get some difference in approach?
Look, certainly happy to look at it again and drive the levels up, but it is absolutely not true that in every case we don't prosecute. In quite a few cases we do prosecute. We have quite a lot of
our understanding is the majority of times is that people are just, if they're willing to give up what they've smuggled in that's detected by the scanner, then that's the end of it.
Yeah, so certainly we can have a look again at whether our decision making in the right place, whether we can do more, but I mean, as you alluded to, it's also trying to get police time, whether we could secure a prosecution, which depends on chain of evidence and all that sort of stuff. So I'm sure there's more we can do, and I will take away to look at that.
Yeah, it might be that you're correct in the decision that you're taking, but if you're kind of seeking to do it and then you're blocked from doing it, then that's a different argument to make to the Home Office than just kind of accepting their position on it. The police forces locally, rather. We can't support and argue for a change if we don't actually have a kind of, there are all these people that would have been prosecuted but for your local police force's decision not to attend.
Look, I certainly accept there's more we can do, and there's probably more referrals we need to make to the police, but it's certainly not our policy that we just don't attempt to get a prosecution. We do.
And just on compensation payments, so I recognise that there's been a number of significant payments, I think 3 over £1 million to staff and prisoners. Sorry, this is kind of just a silly question to ask, but do those necessarily involve an admission of liability, or might some of them not involve an admission of you've done something wrong? And can you tell me the difference?
I think there's only one actually over £1 million.
Right, sorry.
No, it's right. I think the in the hour. I mean, the thing to say is that we obviously, Amy's team work in an environment where they manage a huge amount of risk. So it's not that surprising, as it were, that this would happen. I don't know if you want to say something about the particular.
Well, only to say, look, to be candid, in cases over £1 million, I expect we would, without getting individual cases, we would have admitted liability, because there's.
Yeah. Okay. And what have you learned from those? What are the broad themes, perhaps, that you can draw out from them and some of the other more significant? Because I think you're right. There's just £1 million one, but there's a few that are kind of just below £500,000.
Yeah, as you would expect in a big operational organisation like ours, as the Perm Sex makes managing risk, we have a constant learning programme on this, so we have a review every quarter, then we try and look at the learning particularly from big cases, and then we do change our policies on the back of it. So a recent example, adjudications catering, that's directly come from losing some of these cases, we've changed the policy, but in general our learning is often record keeping, so it's not necessarily that the wrong decision was made, but we need to be able to have a good record keeping. Yeah.
And then final question for me then, similar to the Harlem questions, but just around self-inflicted deaths, which again I think have increased by 22% in the last year. Same question really, is that an historical increase, or is that just an increase from the COVID era? And if it is a genuine historical increase, what have you done about that?
Yeah, so we definitely again had the kind of low period during COVID. It's probably worth calling out the recent stats. So we definitely had a rise, and that's unacceptable. We want to drive it down. But for the last published quarter, October, November, December, it was 1196. And in fact, December this year was 6 self-inflicted deaths as opposed to 12 the December before. It's much too early to say that's a trend, but obviously you can appreciate Christmas is quite a difficult time in our kind of environment. So we were genuinely pleased to have seen a proper noticeable reduction in that period. We now need to keep building on that work. A couple of things I specifically say. Good investment in Samaritans, and in particularly the new thing we've done is post-vention. So copycats are unfortunately a kind of an issue in our world, where you have one and then you might have another one. So we've really tried to work on post-vention, trying to prevent that copycat. And also I would like to call out the PPO. We had a new PPO, Adrian Usher, and he's shown real investment and engagement with us as a service, and trying to get the learning, as we just talked about, but in another context, so that we can try and learn everything we can from every single death in custody.
Can I just little follow-up, just thinking about that horrific case recently where a prisoner on prison officer violence, where he was attacked with a razor blade, and I was really intrigued as to why the wet shave razor blades are not being why there hasn't been a shift from those razor blades to electric shavers, for example. And I think that's a recommendation from the POA. But
I'm really engaged with the POA on this. We had a discussion about it really recently. As you know, we have been piloting. You might know, we've been piloting in some prisons using electrical shavers, which has broadly gone quite well. We've got the evaluation now. We are due to make a decision at the end of March about whether to completely withdraw wet shaving.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm afraid there's still some more for us to get through. The Taylor Review in 2016, so Charlie Taylor, who's now the current HMIP, recommended the opening of secure schools, which essentially is putting education at the heart of where children are in custody. And the Ministry of Justice accepted the recommendations and committed to opening 2, one by autumn 2020. We still don't have a secure school open. We have been told one is going to open this spring. Are you, first of all, able to help us as to when exactly the Medway secure school will open?
Well, look, I think we can't be more precise in the spring at the moment, partly because of all the checks that will have to happen before we put any child in there. And as with all infrastructure projects, as discussed, there might be some snags that arise in between now and the planned date. So I think we want to be more precise in the spring, but it will be the spring, and obviously there's a limit to how long the spring can be.
Shall I just add some detail in case that's helpful? So we are in process now, as you know, for it to be a secure school, it's got to meet the Ofsted registration. We are in the process now of agreeing a date with Ofsted to come and inspect us in April. There is a minimum of 6 weeks if we pass that inspection for registered, so late spring we're hopeful for that date.
Thank you. Some of us are very excited when these were announced. Such a long time ago, though. I was actually a minister back then, believe it or not. But here we are, nearly 8 years on from the review, and we still don't have a secure school open. But also, the original cost then was essentially to convert the Medway Secure Training Centre. It was deemed to be a more efficient financial model for opening a secure school. That original cost was 4.9 million. Now, the best estimate that we can find is 40 million, including a bit of optimism bias in there. So clearly, even taking into account all the things we've already discussed around inflation, construction costs, other hidden costs that weren't anticipated, in the hope, maybe expectation that further secure schools will follow after Medway, what, in terms of due diligence and the process, has the department learnt from this exercise first time round that it will take forward to ensure that we don't have such a similar scenario for future secure schools?
Well, again, perhaps I'll start on this. Obviously, this was a completely innovative approach, as you've identified, hence the excitement when it was first announced. And as a result, some things came up during the course of it that therefore took longer than we had anticipated. So as you'll know, we had to change the law to create a secure academy as a new entity. That therefore took time. We used the Police Crime Sentencing and the Courts Act to do that. So I think things in the planning, which then require legislation, and also obviously a lot of consultation, is one reason for the delay. In terms of the costs, obviously the pandemic, as we've already discussed, had a significant impact on the supply chain, and so that happened exactly in the middle of the plans to when we were trying to think about how we would bring the secure school into land, and that caused a lot of delays from contractors. And like with all our programmes, as we talked about before, construction programmes, we are heavily reliant on contractors and construction materials, so that also caused some delay. We're obviously learning all the time from this approach, because again, that will have impacted the costs as well as the time frame. I don't know if there's more to...
Well, just a couple of things I wanted to add about the learning. I guess for me, the learning is split into 2 groups. One is things that would be repeated, and one is things that wouldn't be. So in the things that wouldn't be repeated, if we built a second one, we now know that we need legislation. We've got that legislation. So there's a load of delays around that would not be repeated because we've done it and we know it. In terms of things that would be, I think we did underestimate what was needed to meet the requirements of the Ofsted inspection and to be a secure children home, as opposed to, I think we thought would be more akin to an STC, a secure training centre. And actually, the requirements, there are a lot. And so I think if we were opening a second one, we would know it would cost a bit more this time to make sure the building itself was up to the regulations expected of Ofsted.
Yeah, I think also fire safety, upgrades, electrical and mechanical infrastructure are all issues that, in hindsight, should have been more closely looked at before embarking on the project. We look forward to it opening. When are we going to see another one? The second one that the department are committed to?
So look, I think as I just talked about, we need to learn a lot of lessons from this one. Lessons that we've already learned in opening it and constructing, but also in our experience of running it. And then, as you would expect, we will need to kind of bid with all that we have learned for how much money there is into a treasury process and see if we can secure funding.
There's no ongoing work to identify another site or to pull together a business case?
No, we do have work already underway for a second site. What we don't have at the money is a pot of money from which we could build that, and we would need to make that part of any new SR.
It's
decisions.
still in all your budget lines and your planning to move forward with a second secure school?
We certainly have identified a site and have some outline costs.
Thank you. Can I just ask you something very recent but relevant to this, and that's the unannounced inspection of HMYY for the Young Offenders Institute at Wetherby on the 5th of March. And that's, for those people perhaps listening or watching this, that's for children who have been sentenced and remanded between the ages of 15 to 18 years. It's only one of 3 different types of this institution that hold actually only 7 currently imprisoned girls in England and Wales. And I think that's a figure that may or may not surprise people. But that inspection identified 11 key concerns, 7 of which are being needed to be treated as a priority. And Charlie Taylor, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, in particular homed in on something which is really quite troubling. And he said that we, as in the Inspectorate, were deeply shocked to find adult male officers restraining and stripping an incredibly vulnerable girl not once but twice, while they no doubt acted to prevent serious harm. The presence of multiple men pinning her down and removing her clothes will have caused further trauma, and given how predictable the behaviour of this particular girl was, the Young Offenders Institute has no excuse not to have made sure that female officers were in attendance. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that that's totally unacceptable. But what is going to follow in terms of actions to ensure, first of all, perhaps there are sufficient female staff deployed there from now on, but also something that the Chief Inspector said was lacking was a national, and I'm quoting from Charlie Taylor, national coherent plan for caring for these girls. So what actions are going to follow?
So, as you rightly note, the report raises really serious concerns about a range of issues, including staffing, education, self-harm, time out of cell, and in particular the example that you gave. And Amy will say a minute about the full action plan that HMPPS have responded to the findings with. But the other thing to say is that, as you also noted, there's a very small number of girls now in custody, and that has fallen by 70% since 2015. So the remaining cohort is a very complex cohort that requires really specialist support, which is why one has to be so careful, and hence that has informed, obviously, the plan that HMPPS has put in place, which is quite comprehensive. So,
I mean, just specifically on the incident, it's worth saying that there is no doubt that incident shouldn't have occurred in the way it did, of course, for the child, but also for the staff involved. But as the Chief Inspector has said himself, it was indeed to prevent very serious harm. Without going into the individual incident with too much detail, there were some very specific challenging circumstances around the individual and her immediate pressing needs. It happened during a night state, so obviously we have less staff during a night. There were some female staff present, but for a variety of reasons, those female staff either couldn't get there or weren't appropriate to be deployed in that incident. A couple of things just to add. We did immediately do a learning review, and also the establishment straight away within 24 hours referred both incidents to the safeguarding review, so to the LADO in the local authority, to look into the incident.
If you're able to share whatever further work is planned off the back of both the inspection, this particular incident, and share it with the committee, it would be very, very helpful. I'm sure the Chair would agree with that.
We will.
Can I ask you one more area, and that's something that was touched on briefly before, and that's around drugs in prisons. And the most recent data on random mandatory drug testing goes back now to 2019-20, so pre-pandemic. And for obvious reasons, during the pandemic, it sort of ebbed away. And although there is now some random drug testing taking place, it's still coming back. I think you'd accept sort of slowly, and certainly not at the level yet which would be required for it to be reliable from a national, even from an establishment level, around the estimates that they need to make it viable. So when will you get to a point where it is viable and that you can rely on the testing to give you a proper readout of what is actually happening in our prisons? The last time that we had that, back in 2019-20, I think it was about 14% of tests for illicit substances were positive, but we simply just don't know at the moment. So when will we?
The first candid thing to say is I would accept it has come back slowly since COVID, and we've had to make choices about that and delivering the regimes and all sorts of things given the challenges that we've had. The second thing I would say is it's not the only source of testing we do. So this is particularly random mandatory testing, but we also do voluntary and compact testing. That is in particular on our ISFLs, the incentivised substance-free living units, and our drug-free units. But also the thing that happened during COVID was we started wastewater testing en masse. We think this might be a really interesting new innovation in terms of where we go with drug testing. We've now got 30 sites where we're doing wastewater testing, so that wouldn't allow us to find out if you as an individual, for example, have been taking drugs, but it does give us a really good indication of the overall prevalence of drug in an establishment and the range of drugs, which we don't always get, for example, from random mandatory testing. So in fact, where we're strategically hoping to go with this is a balance of the two and seeing if we can build out some wastewater testing, because we think having the combination of two would be actually the most reliable way of us knowing what sort of drugs there are in the system, etc.
Part of this is knowing going out of a prison, and obviously wastewater is one way of finding that out, but it's also what's going in the prison, so the drug infiltration levels, type of drugs, and also how they're getting into the prisons. And of course that's getting more and more sophisticated, as we've heard as a committee. For instance, drones are now a growing problem. So how are you ensuring that prison staff are themselves equipped to deal with some of these new and, it would seem, quite effective ways of getting drugs into our prisons?
So look, first of all, you're right that it is something that is ever evolving, not just the methods in, like drones, which we probably wouldn't have been talking about even 3 years ago, probably, in terms of it being a major method of ingress. But the other thing that is evolving is the type of drugs. So we have seen a change, for example, towards synthetic drugs. That was quite a big change for the system. It can change the way you can port it into the system, etc. And also a change towards prescribed medication, which we also have to look out for. In general, there are then two ways we try to manage drugs in the system, and it's demand and supply. Because obviously if there were no demand, because we have managed to effectively get everyone off drugs in prisons, then there would be less reason to try and transmit it into prisons. And then we try and work on supply in the ways you've talked about, including investment in hardware, in actual gate searching, airport-style security, X-ray body scanners, which have had over 40,000 hits of substances and other items that might have been illicitly portrayed into prison.
How confident are you that your drug-free units are drug-free?
I would never want to say that there is zero access to drug because of all the ways we've just been talking about. But what we're trying to work on is the incentive for people and prisoners who want to be there to try and get off drugs so that they can try and get free of the substances. And there is a lot of support in prison for those who want to come off drugs, both from us and partners in the NHS. And the other thing we're really working on, it's the third of our reduce and reoffend targets, is even when we're successful at getting them off in drugs, we know it only works long term if you can then manage them back out into the community and join up that drug treatment. So we're really trying to work on that aspect as well.
Thank you. Thanks. Finally, we're going to wrap up with some courts and judiciary related issues. Perhaps you could just help me about this, really. Looking at the position with the Crown Court and the backlog, talking about things that have been going on for some time, like the secure schools. Back in November 2021, Mr. Cartledge, when he was the junior minister, said that the plan was to reduce Crown Court backlogs caused by the pandemic from 60,000 today to 53,000 estimate by March 2022. 2025. The Lady Chief Justice, when she gave evidence to us, was pretty frank about the fact that without some radical reform, that wasn't achievable. Do you accept that now?
So obviously, the story of the outstanding caseload is that while just before the pandemic at the end of 2019 it was 38,000, it then went up post-pandemic. So June 2021 it was 61,000. Shortly after that was when former Minister Cartledge came in front of the committee. By quarter one 2022 it was down at 58,000. But unfortunately then between the spring and the summer was the CBA... Now
66,000, isn't it?
Well, between the spring and the summer was the CBA disruptive action, which obviously meant that the courts to a large extent were functioning in a different way, and now it is back up at 66,000. So it's a story of a number of things happening during this process that has taken us off course, I would say. The things we are doing to get it down, and there's a raft of measures. I mean, we're funding unlimited sitting days. So we funded over 100,000 sitting days in the last financial year, as is in the annual report and accounts. We've done the same this year. We funded the in 23-24. Will also be, we expect to sit, the number will be greater than that. It's again been unlimited. I don't want to prejudge what will happen next time, but we're aware of the view that you, Sir Bobbin, is obviously true, that funding unlimited sitting days in the Crown Court is very important. We've also we're on track to recruit 1,000 more judges and tribunal members, because judicial capacity has in the past been a constraint, but we don't want it to be, and neither does the Lady Chief Justice. We have invested, the government announced last year £220 million of court maintenance for the next 2 years, so this year and next year across all jurisdictions, in essential repairs and modernisations. That was a significant increase on the amount of money that we had originally been able to allocate from the budget. So we got new money from the Treasury for that, as well as redeploying some money from elsewhere in MOJ. We've got the Nightingale courtrooms that we will continue to use as long as necessary, and they represent value for money, and we've got 20 of those we will be taking forward into 2024-25 financial year. So we're straining every sinew to bear down on the outstanding caseload.
Are submissions being made, for example, to meet Baroness Carr's point, that not having a cap on sitting days is, in her words, I quote, critical? Submissions being made to try and maintain that position?
Yes, I mean, obviously we're having the conversations at the moment on the Concordat, and as I say, we're doing allocations, but we're well aware of what needs to happen in this place.
Is any support being given by the department, by the ministry, more accurately, to the work of the Crown Court Improvement Group, the group that Lord Justice Edis chairs as presiding judge, to try and bear down on things like timeliness from offence to completion and so on? What's HMCS Romeo J doing, Mr. Goodwin, to try and support them in that work?
I mean, there is support to the Crown Court Improvement Group. As you say, it's judicially chaired, so it's the senior presiding judge, and through her reporting to the Lady Chief Justice. So it is kind of in the judicial line, but it convenes people throughout the system to have those discussions. I think there's a particularly strong role of both policymakers within the ministry to be engaged with that, but also ourselves to provide the right sort of information and insight that allow judges to effectively pull the levers to make sure case management is good. So, but it's not just that. There are quite a lot of other cross criminal justice system fora that are actually trying to make sure that cases go through as smoothly as possible. I mean, Antonia chairs, for example, the Criminal Action Justice Group, which is one such forum where we're trying to bear down on ineffective trials, for example. Antonia articulated very well where we are. I think there's a couple of points I think it's worth just being really clear about, which is we are straining every sinew. Disposals are up significantly. We will sit even more sitting days in the year currently. In fact, I think we'll sit a record number of sitting days going back for a great many years. And that's all good, but the receipts coming into the system are up even more. And the receipts coming into the system are particularly made up of sexual offences and violence offences, which means the case mix is really, really difficult. So that's the reason why it's proving a stubborn beast to shift. There are some good signs there, but it really is a stubborn problem at the moment.
And of course, one of the difficulties that arises is, as well as judicial capacity and sitting days, it's the availability of barristers to prosecute those particularly serious cases. Our discussions being had with the Treasury about maintaining fee levels to ensure that we get barristers attracted to do those serious and more complex cases, both prosecute and defend.
Well, so as you rightly note, I mean, this is a case of supply and demand. So we've already injected a significant amount of money, 141 million in steady state, into as a result of the response to the Criminal Legal Aid Independent Review. So we're expecting that on average, a barrister will earn an additional £7,000 a year. We're obviously hoping that those additional fees will attract more people into the profession. So, and the other thing to say is, of course, there's another key driver is the amount of work that there is, and there's a lot of work now. So we're expecting that should attract people into the profession. We've obviously seen the recent surveys and things, and we're talking to the professions about that.
Lord Bellamy recommended that injection, of course, as the minimum required to maintain, if you like, a steady state at the time that he made his report, which is already out of date now. Part of his recommendation was to have a committee, a body to update and review the fees as they went along. What steps have been done to take to put that in place? Is it meeting, and how often? So
that body has been set up, and it's chaired by a judge, and it is it's the Criminal Legal Aid Action Board, or
something like that.
And it was set up in response to Claire, as you know, to look at the operation and structure of fee schemes now and in the future, including to to look at all the fee schemes. One of the things that it has been looking at, and as a result of this, we have been consulting. We've got a consultation underway to look at injecting that will lead to an extra 21 million being invested in criminal legal aid solicitors, and that consultation closes at the end of March as part of those reforms. And that is aimed at front-loading money in the system, because something else that the committee has discussed before is you've got to really front-load investment at the beginning of the system. So we're injecting that money will go towards, for example, police station fees, as well as some of the youth justice work.
There was some litigation that went on between the Law Society and the Ministry in relation to the solicitors' element of the advocates, graduated advocates' fees schemes, where the contention was that they hadn't had the full 15% recommended by Bellamy, but they got rather less, about 9%, which I don't think was actually disputed. All events, it comes to this, doesn't it, that the Law Society won their court action, and the High Court ruled in the Society's favour, and the government, fair enough, has said it's not going to appeal that decision.
I think that's not. So there were 4 grounds, and the claimants were successful, I think, on on 2 quite specific narrow grounds on 2 particular points. So a number of arguments were rejected and some were upheld.
Beyond saving the department's face, the fact is, on the substantive issue, the Law Society won. So when are you going to pay them the money?
I'm not sure that's quite right, Chair.
Are you going to hold on about not paying the money, Ms. Romeo?
No, on the substantive issue. The question is what you consider a substantive issue to be. Obviously, we're considering the judgment carefully and we'll respond in due course. But actually, I think if you look at the grounds, there are some quite specific grounds on which the government will now be responding. And obviously, we're going to abide completely. I mean, I think the Law Society didn't appeal. So we'll obviously abide by what the High Court... the grounds of the High Court upheld.
I mean, the crunch is this, that people are leaving the profession, the criminal profession. Bellamy recommended 15%. A previous Lord Chancellor took a decision not to pay the full 15%. That was litigated. And the result of the litigation now, is the full 15% going to be paid, and when? And if so, when? Well,
look, I don't want to prejudge, because actually, if you look at what has been upheld, it's in particular ways that we will need to make the decisions. So we're considering the judgment very carefully. We're going to respond in due course. But I just want to reiterate, we are investing an additional 141 million in steady state, and we've got the additional 21 million, which is specifically looking at investment on police stations, as I mentioned, which we think will provide an uplift of 11% for solicitors.
But it's still not Bellamy, 15%, is it?
Well, I mean,
it's obvious, isn't it? And we said 15% minimum, and they haven't got 15%. And the department's arguing the toss.
As I say, we're going to respond to the judgment, and we'll certainly be abiding by what the judgment has says that the department should do, definitely.
You understand that damages faith between the ministry and the professions, the sense that the department, forgive my saying so, is finding almost every legal avenue to wriggle out of paying that which Bellamy recommended.
Well, I'm not. I mean, this is a question. Perhaps there's things that matters for officials and things that are matters for ministers.
It may not be your decision, but of course, it was a decision by a previous Secretary of State. But I just wondered what, as the accounting officer, your view was about the, given the judgment about whether or not it's actually more cost-effective just to pay up rather than risk ongoing tension and risk of litigation.
So my view is obviously that we will completely abide by what the judgment, without a doubt. And we're considering judgment, and then we'll be abiding by that. We also have found money, as accounting officer, I did find money in the budget to pay for the response to Claire as a result of the Bellamy report. And we will be, I think the club that was set up in response and that is going to look at additional investment needed is going to be absolutely crucial. I think from my point of view, what really matters is value for money and incentives. So it's not, as you expect an accounting officer to say this, it's not just about the total pot. The question is what is being paid for and how do you most appropriately judge the payments that should go, fees that should go according to different bits of work. That is detailed work that I do think needs to happen, and I think Club are going to oversee that.
Okay, no, that's what you mentioned, the extra money for court maintenance. I mean, I think Baroness Carr gave evidence that they were losing something like 100 unplanned courtroom closures every week. 200, near 200 every month. Do you reckon, is it estimated that additional funding that you've secured is likely to make a significant difference to that number of unplanned court closures that the Lady Chief Justice referred to?
Well, the number of sitting days lost due to planned and unplanned maintenance is something like 0.1%. But there might be, but Nick will want to comment on that particular.
Yes, I mean, what the Lady Chief Justice said is probably right, but as Antonia said, when you look at our ability to then juggle trials to ensure we don't lose, sitting days are actually quite effective. That is disruptive. Will the extra money make a difference? Yes, it will make a big difference because quite a lot of what we're investing in is things like roofs, heating systems, cooling systems, and the stuff that takes our courts out of. It's hot summers, so actually getting the cooling operating and working well means we'll have much less disruption in the courts. And having a better budget than we plan for, once spread over 2 years, is really important. It means we're better able to plan. And so it's a real boon, and I think it will make a difference. We will try and track as far as possible the evidence to show that it has, but it's a real godsend. So.
Okay. And of course, the other thing on court estate is that some courts have been identified as having rack concrete, like many other public buildings. Are bids being made, for example, to Treasury for any separate funding for that? Because you've got your maintenance, which you've very fairly set out, Mr Goodwin, that we need to catch up on. What about the particular crisis of RAC?
In many ways, we've been quite fortunate with RAC.
Not as many as
for two reasons. One, we were very much ahead of the game. We started surveying for it extremely early. And actually, we've not found that many RACs. So RAC has affected 10 court buildings, 5 are already in the clear. 2, which is actually one court in Blackpool, we're not going to reopen. And that doesn't cost us anything because we've already got investment plans to replace the court in Blackpool. So that boils us down to 3 courts. The example, and we have spent, just for the record, we spent about 1.2 million on looking at those issues. But to give you an example, Harrow, which is a big court in London and is closed until April next year, we were already in there taking the roof off and we found the rack. So in essence, that there's not a need for sort of additional expenditure because the roof would have to be replaced there. We will correct the rack within our buildings maintenance budget, but we have spent a bit more. It's displaced some activity, about 1.2 million, as I said. But we're very much on top of it. I think we're coming to the end of our rack saga.
Okay, that's helpful. And then finally on civil legal aid, we know that back in September, October of last year, the Ministry actually did a user provider survey. And and that sort of suggested that 42% of providers said they'd leave the civil aid sector in the short term, in the next year, and in the long term, 40% said they were looking to leave. Now, we know that there's been a legal aid review. Any idea when the report's going to be published for a start?
Well, so this is the review's evident. This review, which is the review of civil legal aid, the evidence building phase is planned to conclude by May this year.
As it started, it was announced in January 2023, wasn't it?
So there's been, I mean, it's been ongoing for, there's been a lot of evidence.
It's been running
to
a
gather.
long time, hasn't it? Yeah.
And then it'll move to policy development phase, and with a green paper targeted to launch in July this year with some policy options is the intention.
But you've now got, July policy options, but you've got people saying from your own provider survey, and some are saying, look, in a year or so's time, we're going to be off, we're going to be out of the market because we frankly can't afford it anymore. What work is being done with ministers, perhaps and Treasury, to identify perhaps some interim measures in advance of the report that can try and arrest some of those very alarming statistics from civil legal aid providers?
You're quite right, Chair. There's lots of work ongoing already. So some examples, we're launching the Housing Loss Prevention Advice Service, which provides early legal advice for people at risk of eviction or possession. And that's an injection of an additional £10 million a year. We're increasing fees by 15% for work done under the Illegal Migration Act, and we're providing £1.5 million in funding for recruitment of trainee housing solicitors and up to £1.4 million for accreditation of immigration caseworkers. So we are injecting more money now, but we obviously want to do this big evidence-based piece of work.
Okay, well, perhaps you can keep us updated with that as well. I'm sure.
Happy to.
Sure we will. We're virtually at the end now, and I think this is the probably the last time that she'll come and do the annual report to the committee in this Parliament. It does strike me that since I've chaired this committee, there have been 9 Lord Chancellors and Secretaries of State. Without making any observations about that, because those are political decisions, does a frequent change of departmental minister at the top create additional managerial pressures for yourself and your senior civil servants? And if so, how do you manage that?
Well, I think 2 points on this. One is what civil servants are very adept at doing is the main part of our job is we support the government, and we therefore understanding what the ministers wish to do, what the agenda is, and that can be a change of Secretary of State, or it can be a change of government. A number of changes. We are adept at understanding what that what the vision is, what the agenda is, and then making sure it's delivered, and that's the job. Yeah. The other thing I would say is that in a large operational department, obviously a lot of things that a lot of our staff do, they do that aren't massively impacted on a day-to-day basis by a change of government. But I think they all do, and again, I want to pay tribute to MOJ staff for doing it with professionalism, but building really strong relationships with the Secretary of State and with ministers to ensure that we can understand and deliver their agenda is an absolutely essential part of the job, and I'm really privileged to do it.
Is there a tension, do you think, between having the prisons and probations on the one hand and the courts, which actually drive the demand for the prisons probation on the other in the same department? Or how do you manage that?
Well, this is
largely
well above my pay grade.
But from a purely practical point of view, how do you manage it?
From a purely practical point of view, I think bringing things together, as Amy has mentioned in another context, the handoffs are the thing when somebody is in the system that are the hardest to manage. So from an official point of view, having a system where you have more of it end to end, both what we have within the department, but also Nick mentioned the Criminal Justice Action Group, where we work closely with the Attorney General's office and the Home Office and the police, and the CPS. Being able to look end to end is the only way to actually be effective in what you're trying to deliver, which is ultimately keep people out of the criminal justice system and bear down on reoffending and crime, as well as protecting the public, but also doing that in a way that's efficient. So in my view, bringing things together I often think is an efficient way to do it. But obviously it's one model and there are others.
There can be others, okay. Well, look, thank you very much, Ms. Romeo, Ms. Rees, Mr. Goodwin, Ms. McEwen, for your evidence, and Ms. Romeo, over to you.
Sorry, before you finish, there were just 3 things I wanted to say.
Yes,
about 4 things, 3 of which are very quick quick corrections. One of which is thank you very much. And if this is the last time that I'm going to be doing this, coming on the, and I just want to say thank you very much to the committee and for the scrutiny and for the scrutiny and support. 3 quick corrections, if I may, Chair, and obviously thank you very much to you. One is on pressures. It was actually, I think I slightly misspoke. It's £55 million of pressure of prison officer pay. On the productivity review, I said I thought it was over 2 years. In fact, the money is up to 2029. And thirdly, on compensation payments, when I said there was 1, it's actually 1 to a member of staff, but you were correct, there were 3 because 2 were to prisoners. So I just wanted to get that on the record.
That's fair enough. Thank you very much, Mr. Romeo. And can I thank you and your officials for the way you do engage with us? So sometimes we have to probe, but I hope it's always done in a constructive manner. And I'm grateful personally to you and your officials for the courtesy you've all shown me and the members of the committee. There may be different personnel, perhaps, by the time you're next. But in some cases, there will be different personnel when you come to your next annual report. But I'm sure there'll be other areas where we're continuing to engage with the department.
Thank you very much, Chair, and to the committee.
Thank you. Session is concluded. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.